So we reason about what to believe, right? We reason about how to act. And these are types of reasoning or deliberation that normative philosophy has been looking into since Aristotle, I would say. But we also reason and deliberate about what questions we should raise, okay? And this is a type of phenomenon which is comparatively less studied than the doxastic and practical varieties, okay? So basically the aim of the talk is to get clear a little bit about what this erotetic deliberation, erotetic means, is from ancient Greek, erotesis, which means kind of pertaining to questions, okay? So the aim of the paper is to get clear about what this phenomenon really is. And especially I want to point to some key normative features of reasoning about questions that hopefully in the last bit of my talk will get us to talk a little bit about two social phenomena that have to do with questions. One involves trust, the other involves injustice, okay? So in the first part of the talk, I want to just describe a little bit the phenomenon with some easy cases. Then the central part of the paper, I want to sort of give arguments for thinking that erotetic deliberation is sensitive to different types of normative considerations, okay? I will clarify what I mean exactly by normative considerations. And then the third part, I want to apply sort of my central discussion to trust and injustice having to do with questions, okay? So that's a plan of the talk. So I have two very easy cases at the beginning of the handout, which I'm just going to read, okay? The first one is called plants. Suppose that arriving at your front door, you see the soil of your outdoor plants all on the ground, and you also see some branches of your plants on the ground. And you think to yourself, okay, what happened here? There was no wind at all today, so someone must have done it. But who did it? Then you keep thinking to yourself, you keep reasoning, right? The neighbors used to have a dog, Billy, who liked to play with my plants, but haven't seen Billy for a long time. So I wonder whether they still have a dog, okay? The second case is a bit more immediate. So suppose you're here, you're attending this lecture, an elephant enters the room, a small one maybe. You think to yourself, why is there an elephant in the room, okay? So both cases are cases of erotetic, of what I'm calling erotetic deliberation, okay? Reasoning about questions, okay? And now I want to give you like some details about why I think that this is reasoning, why I think that this is reasoning about question, and what that really involves, okay? So some things about deliberation and reasoning in general. I'm going to be using the doxastic and the practical cases as examples, okay? Because those are cases that we kind of are familiar with in philosophy, normative philosophy. And I will try to specify where I think that erotetic deliberation is different from the more ordinary cases that we're familiar with, okay? The general idea of the general notion of deliberation reasoning that I'm using here is the notion of a mental activity which has a certain aim, goal, or function, or point. So when we're reasoning or deliberating about what to believe, we have a certain question in mind. Is P true? Is the proposition P true? When we're reasoning about how to act, we have a slightly different question in mind. Is the action fine, choice-worthy? Or perhaps a slightly different question might be, what am I going to do? Okay. So the idea is that deliberation reasoning is this type of mental activity, okay, which we try to resolve these questions, okay, by giving reasons, okay, by being sensitive to reasons, by responding to some reasons. And in the doxastic case, if the question is P true, what are the reasons that we're trying to respond to? Those are going to be reasons that speak in favor or against the truth of the proposition, okay? Most likely evidential reasons for belief. Erotetic deliberation is also a mental activity which has a certain aim, and the aim could be spelled out in terms of a question: is the question Q worthy of being raised? Okay? And of course, part of my job here is to tell you what worthy of being raised means, okay? This is going to be the central part of my talk. Now, I'm using doxastic and practical examples, okay? But those are two different types of deliberations, okay? Because clearly we can reason and deliberate at will about what we're going to do, okay? I can just decide to pick up the bottle and for whatever reason, and I do it. By contrast, I can't decide to believe that the moon is made of cheese, just like that, okay? Beliefs doesn't seem to be under our voluntary control, at least the way in which action is, okay? So clearly, now the question arises, what kind of control is involved in the mental activity that I'm calling erotetic deliberation? What kind of control we have in cases such as plants or lecture? Can we will our curiosity just like we can will our actions, or is it more like belief, okay? And my impression is that the kind of control that's involved in erotetic deliberation is more similar to belief than action, okay? We can't just decide to be curious about anything, okay? Which means that the type of control involved in the mental activity of erotetic deliberation has little to do with now I'm going to decide to be curious, to wonder about a given certain question, but it has more to do with some sort of subpersonal, in most cases, regulatory mechanisms of formation, retention, revision, which are sensitive to reason. So in the case of belief, right, what does it mean to say that we have control over our beliefs and that we can deliberate and reason about our beliefs? It just means that we are sensitive, we are disposed to form beliefs when there's evidence in favor of the truth of the proposition. We are disposed to revise those beliefs if there's counter evidence. Okay? These dispositions, which are counterfactuals, show our sensitivity to reasons. In this case, in the doxastic case, to evidential reasons. And the same type of subpersonal non-volitional control is involved also in erotetic deliberation, okay? So in this case, erotetic deliberation is more similar to doxastic deliberation than to practical deliberation, okay? So the cases plants and lecture are pretty different, right? In the case plants, it seems that we're really sort of inferring, right? So we have premises, we have conclusions, we're kind of consciously going through the steps of our reasoning. So we have premises. It makes sense to say that there are certain premises, certain conclusions. It's just that some of the premises are questions and some of the conclusions also are questions, right? Instead of being beliefs or intentions, okay? This is what makes this piece of reasoning erotetic as opposed to doxastic or practical. By contrast, lecture seems to be a case in which we are immediately responding to reasons, right? We just, an elephant entered the room, and we just start wondering, what the hell is going on, right? So we're not really, that doesn't seem to be a super demanding inferential process happening there in the second case, right? But both cases share a general feature, which is the idea exactly that the conclusions that we are arriving at, which are questions. I wonder whether they still have a dog, for instance, in the first case, or why is there an elephant in the room, right? These are interrogative sentences that express questions, right? These conclusions are conclusions that are based on something, okay? Some cases are explicit premises, in other cases are more sort of unconscious type of reasoning happening, okay? But both types of cases share this feature, right? That are bases for our judgment. There are reasons for which we end up wondering whether the neighbors still have a dog, and there are reasons for which we end up wondering whether there's an elephant, why there's an elephant in the room, okay? So instead of talking of premises, which is very common when we talk about reasoning, I'm going to be having this like more relaxed notion of basis, grounds for our conclusions in mind, okay? So there is much more to be said about reasoning and deliberation, but this is all I need for now, just to give you a little bit more detail about sort of the descriptive features of the phenomenon, okay? So something about questions, okay? So what are questions? So questions, it's really hard to say what a question is, okay? As a sort of metaphysical point. What is a question, right? Surely one thing that we can say, we can all agree on, is that questions are not true or false, right? Doesn't make any sense to say that a question is truth-apt. And so what we can say is, since propositions are truth-apt, what we can say is that questions are not propositions, okay? But questions are related to answers, okay? So one way to answer the question of what questions are is to say that they are just sets of possible answers, okay? Where answers are propositions, okay? So truth-evaluable things. So I don't care very much about the semantic object of questions, okay? Fine to say those are sets of potential possible answers, okay? I don't need much more about this. What I need are some distinctions that we can trace by looking at the different types of answers that questions can receive, okay? So I'm going to be looking now at the notion of questions through the lens of the different types of answers that a question can receive in order to define a notion that's going to be important in the normative part of the talk, okay? So take, for instance, the question expressed by the sentence, who wrote knowledge and its limits, okay? So I'm just going to be giving you some distinctions about different types of answers. There are what we might call direct answers. Federica wrote it, Christoph wrote it. Okay? Those are direct answers to the question. There are partial answers to the question. Either Tim or Christoph wrote it. Why it's a partial answer? Well, because I'm not giving, because the question is asking for one, and I'm giving you two options, right? So this is just a partial answer. It's a disjunction. There are eliminative answers. I say, who didn't write it? Federica didn't write it. That still is an answer in which I'm eliminating a potential, a possible true proposition as answer to the question, right? And there are also corrective answers, which are answers that, in a way, really sort of question the presuppositions of your own question, right? For instance, like I said, there's no such a book, okay? Well, you know, for better or for worse, the book exists, so that would be a bad corrective answers, okay? But if I said there is no such a book, I would be questioning the presupposition of my own question, right? Namely that there is such a book. Okay. Why do I need all these distinctions? I need these distinctions to define the notion of soundness of a question, okay? A question is sound just in case it has a true direct answer, okay? And this is a notion that's I'm not defining it myself. This is a notion that's been defined in inferential erotetic logic. So it's a notion that has a long tradition, and it's a notion that's going to play a role in the central part of the paper, okay? For now, we just have this notion, okay? A question that has a true direct answer, such as the question, who wrote knowledge and its limits, is a sound question, okay? And I will be saying something about the notion of soundness. I will be saying something more later on, okay? So I've said something about reasoning and deliberation. I've said something about questions. Now I want to say something about the attitudes involved in our reasoning, okay? Because, of course, reasoning is a mental activity, something that operates on our mental states, doesn't operate just on semantic objects per se, doesn't just operate on propositions or on questions. That's formal logic, that's fine. but mental reasoning is something that operates on our mental states, okay? And in the examples I've sometimes reported some of those mental states. For instance, at the end of the case plans, I have, so I wonder whether they still have a dog, right? So I'm ascribing to myself an interrogative attitude, which embeds an interrogative complement, right? And so there's a class of attitudes which are called interrogative attitudes, attitudes such as wondering, curiosity, pondering, puzzlement, which are not propositional, okay? So these are attitudes that take as their objects questions and not propositions, okay? And of course, these are all different types of attitudes, okay? At least a good case can be made in favor of the idea that these are different types of attitudes, okay? I'm not going to go into the details of how to spell, how to tell the difference between wondering, curiosity, pondering, and puzzlement, okay? I'm not going to do this type of sort of type individuation kind of job, although it's super interesting, because I want to look at the phenomenon of erotic deliberation in general. So I want my claims to be true about all the interrogative attitudes, okay? So I want to isolate two features that it seems to me all these attitudes have, okay? And the first feature is that they have epistemic satisfaction conditions. What does that mean? Take curiosity. Suppose that you're curious about whether I'm 40 years old, okay? That curiosity gets sachet that gets satisfied if you find out whether or not I'm 40 years old, right? So, if you come to know the answer to this question, if you find the true answer to that question, okay? And so notions such as truth, knowledge, right, justification maybe, those are epistemic notions. And for these reasons, curiosity has epistemic satisfaction conditions. Your curiosity is satisfied when you come to know, for instance, the answer to the question that you're wondering about, okay? And this, so the fact that interrogative attitudes have epistemic satisfaction conditions doesn't mean, of course, that they all have the same epistemic satisfaction conditions. I think this is key to distinguishing all these different attitudes, right? So for instance, Federica, a couple of years ago, gave a paper on puzzlement, and she was arguing for sort of a relation between puzzlement and understanding. So it might very well be the case that what satisfies your curiosity is knowledge, but what satisfies your puzzlement is understanding, and those two epistemic properties are different, okay? Still, they're both epistemic properties, and this is what I care about, okay? And this makes interrogative attitudes really sort of distinctive, right? Because they have something epistemic going on, right? Because the satisfaction conditions, the function of these attitudes is in a way to raise a question with the aim to resolve it, with the aim of finding out the answer. So it has something epistemic involved into it, although the content of these attitudes is not something that is truth evaluable, because the contents of these attitudes are questions and not propositions, and questions are not truth evaluable, okay? This is what makes these attitudes so interesting to me, right? So distinctive. They have something epistemic going on. They have satisfaction conditions which are epistemic, unlike desires, for instance, which have, satisfaction. My desire to drink water gets satisfied when I start drinking, when something happens in the world, right? Something not necessarily epistemic happens. By contrast, in the case of curiosity, something epistemic needs to happen in order for that attitude to be satisfied, right? So this is the first feature that's important. And the second feature that I think is also important is that these attitudes really take questions as their contents, okay? They're not metacognitive attitudes. And what do I mean by that? So one might say that, for instance, take curiosity. That curiosity, if you're curious about whether I'm 40 years old, the content, what your attitude really is, embeds another attitude. What you are in fact you have a desire to know, for instance, or to believe truly about my age. Okay, so we are spelling out in this case the curiosity in terms of an attitude towards another attitude, knowledge. Okay, and so this is what would make the interrogative attitudes metacognitive as opposed to first order, right? But I want them to be first order, and I think there are good reasons for thinking that they are first order, which is in a way helps my claim that erotetic deliberation really is distinctive, okay, because it doesn't reduce to maybe practical deliberation happening at the metacognitive level. I want them to be first order attitudes, okay, because those are really the conclusions of our reasoning. And I think they're not metacognitive for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, it's just some linguistic evidence. I mean, admittedly, that's not super strong evidence, but it is a little bit of evidence that when we look at these reports of interrogative attitudes, they really embed interrogative contents, right? I wonder whether they still have a dog. That's an interrogative complement. And just like what we say about belief, you know, that a belief report, a belief ascription embeds a propositional content, that's evidence for thinking that the content of a belief is just a proposition, is not another mental state. And the same reasoning applies here. The content of this attitude, of the attitude of wondering, is not another mental state, it's just a question. Okay? That's just small linguistic evidence in favor of the claim. And second reason, which I think is a bit more interesting, is that it seems plausible to think that non-human animals that just lack the metacognitive abilities, it seems plausible to think that they do wonder and are curious about certain things. Okay. I'm not citing here, I think what was a mistake, a couple of nice papers by Peter Carruthers on the topic. There's a 2018 paper in Mind and Language, and then there's a 2024 paper in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, in which Carruthers, just looking at empirical evidence from animal studies, just make the point, tries to make the point that, you know, animals really wonder about questions, okay? While lacking the required metacognitive abilities to just represent states of knowledge, for instance. Okay, so I've said something about sort of, I've been trying to describe the phenomenon a little bit, okay? What deliberation is, what questions are, what interrogative attitudes are, okay? So in the paper, I try to give an argument for claiming that really erotetic deliberation is not just a species of practical or doxastic deliberation. Okay? I'm happy to talk about this during the Q&A, but I'm not going to give the argument right now because I want to move to the more sort of normative stuff, which I think is a bit more interesting, especially for the lecture series and for us in general, I think. And so in the kind of question that I want to look at, so we have these examples. Now we know a little bit about what erotetic deliberation really involves, right? And the kind of question that now I want to try to sort of to tackle is the question, okay, what type of consideration is a consideration that speaks in favor of concluding your erotetic deliberation one way as opposed to another? Otherwise put, let's look at how in the case plants, I conclude my reasoning. So I conclude my reasoning with wondering whether they still have a dog. Okay, what does speak in favor of concluding my deliberation that way, or else what speaks against concluding my erotetic deliberation that way as opposed to another? Okay, so this is the kind of question that I'm looking at, right? And so I'm looking at the question of what the normative reasons for taking forming, revising, retaining interrogative attitudes are, okay? And so this is really a question about what sometimes gets called substantive rationality or substantive normativity, which is different from what sometimes gets called structural normativity. So structural normativity really has to do with coherence. So when someone says, okay, if you believe P, then do not believe not P, that's a coherence norm. That's a norm of structural rationality that doesn't tell you what to believe, right? It tells you that if you have this belief in a proposition, just don't believe its contradiction. How can you solve this potential incoherence? Either you give up the former or you give up the latter. This norm doesn't tell you what to believe, right? And this is why it's a norm of structural rationality. It has to do with the structure of your mental states. I'm not looking at this notion of structural rationality. I'm really looking at the reasons that speak in favor of just taking one particular attitude as opposed to another, okay? So I'm really looking at the substantive normative reasons here. And there's a general question about, okay, so how can we tell, right? How can we tell, especially because, how can we tell at a very general level, right? Because we have different cases. We have the doxastic case, belief, evidence. Then we have the practical case, action, intention, morality, moral reasons. And then we have the erotetic case, which shares features with both cases, but I've been trying to argue already that just it's hard to reduce to one of these other familiar phenomena, right? So how can we tell in general when a consideration speaks in favor of taking a given attitude, be that attitude a belief, an intention, or an interrogative attitude, right? So what I want to do right now is to just give you 3 tests for answering this question at the very general level. So for whatever type of deliberation you're looking at, these 3 tests should give you sort of some guidance about how to tell what the types of considerations that speak in favor of taking that attitude. Now, of course, I want to apply the tests to interrogative attitudes and to erotic reasoning, but the idea is that these tests really are tests for determining normative support, irrespective of whether it's for belief, for intention, or for interrogative attitudes, okay? And the 3 tests rely on a sort of very general idea, okay? And the very general idea is that normativity, norms of rationality are guiding, okay? Those are things, the norms that are truly prescriptive, right? That really tell us what to do in terms of belief, in terms of action, in terms of interrogative attitude, in terms of questions, are really norms that we can follow and that can guide us, okay? And so the first idea, what I call the motivation test here on the handout, is the idea that the reasons that speak in favor of taking a certain attitude are also the reasons for which we can take that attitude, okay? So those are the reasons that can motivate us to believe, to have an intention, to wonder about a certain question, okay? Why? Well, because if normativity really guides us, right, in the doxastic, practical, or erotetic case, then it must be possible for us exactly to adopt a certain attitude for the reason that's specified in the norm that we're looking at, okay? And so the first idea is that a given consideration speaks in favor of taking an interrogative attitude if the consideration if we can be moved, if we have the ability to be moved, motivated by that consideration to take the attitude. So take the case of belief, right? The fact that I like cheese so much doesn't move me to believe that the moon is made of cheese, right? I just can't be motivated by this reason. The fact that there's plenty of scientific evidence in favor of the fact that the moon is a planet, blah, 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 that motivates me to believe that the moon is not made of cheese. Okay? So in this case, evidential reasons are motivating reasons for belief. By contrast, it seems that what I like in terms of cheese or anything just doesn't move me to believe that the moon is made of cheese. Can move me to make huge efforts to really strive to believe it, to get myself to believe it, but not directly to believe it. Okay? And the same holds for interrogative attitudes. So this is the first test, the motivation test. And the second and the third test, again, normativity is guiding, okay? Should guide us. And so it must be possible for us to sort of non-accidentally follow a norm, okay? And when we do that, when we non-accidentally follow a norm, we deserve to be praised, okay? We deserve some credit for doing it, as opposed to when we just accidentally, by mere luck, believe truly, okay? You've been lucky this time, but it's not like that you're really sort of being guided by the truth, in this case. You're just, by sheer chance, you're just believing truly, in cases in which you believe without evidence, okay? And the same holds when you believe against the evidence, when you have the evidence, okay? When you believe against the evidence and you do have the evidence, well, it seems fitting to criticize you. A little bit, at least, yeah, to just reduce the credibility score. Someone could tell you, okay, but you had the evidence, why did you form the contradictory belief in the proposition? It seems okay to reduce your credibility score in these cases. And so it seems that to this idea that normativity really guides us, really correspond a set of practices. There's a criticizability practice, which says that if it is fitting to criticize the subject for failing to form a certain attitude on the basis of that consideration, and the consideration sufficiently counts in favor of taking the attitude, then it's fitting to criticize you. Why? Well, because you have the consideration, but you're not taking the attitude that speaks in its favor, okay? So to truly prescriptive norms, criticism is attached. And also praise when everything goes according to plan. And the third test says that just like you can be criticized, you can also defend yourself, okay? If you're really guided by some considerations which is truly normative, then you can appeal to that consideration to sort of provide a partial defense of what you did, okay? So for instance, suppose that you're playing chess and that you like chess very much. It just makes you feel really, really, really good about yourself. So it's something that really matters prudentially to you, okay? Your well-being, it's not that entirely depends on it, but part of your well-being depends on you playing a certain number of chess games in a day. So you're playing a game of chess, but then you have to rush to the airport because a dear friend of yours is coming. You haven't seen them in 2 years, and so you have to pick them up from the airport. But you don't go, okay? You keep playing chess. Well, I mean, it seems fitting to criticize you, right? Because friendship imposes certain moral demands on us. So you should go pick your friend up from the airport. But suppose then you defend yourself by saying, you know, I really need to play chess. Chess really makes me feel good. So that's why I kept playing chess instead of rushing to the airport. Maybe you did overall speaking, you did the practically wrong thing, so you're criticizable. But what you're replying in terms of a defense kind of makes sense. Makes sense, I mean, provides you with a partial excuse. Okay, you're wrong, but I see where you're coming from. Because why? Well, because you're showing concern for what is prudentially right for you. And well-being is one of the dimensions. It's not the only one because there's morality, of course, but well-being is one of the normative dimensions that we should pay attention to while deciding what to do, right? And so the idea is that what is the general idea of the defensibility test? The idea is that if a certain consideration really is normative, okay, really speaks in favor of taking a certain attitude, of wondering, for instance, about whether the neighbors still have a dog, then that consideration can be appealed to by you while you're trying to defend yourself in case you're being criticized, okay? So the tests are spelled out in some sort of detail. But these are the three ideas, okay? So normative considerations motivate us. We can be criticized if we don't follow them, and we can defend ourselves by appealing to them. Now, the next part of the talk basically is to apply these three tests to our examples, okay? And the first claim that I want to defend is that erotetic deliberation is sensitive to practical considerations, okay? So let's go through these two examples, plants 2 and plants 3 that you have on the handout. So the first case, the case plants 2 goes like this. It's a continuation of our first initial case, okay? Suppose that as you're wondering whether it was a mouse or a squirrel who made sort of a mess because you ended up thinking that the neighbors no longer have the dog, so you came to the conclusion that it could have been either a mouse or a squirrel, and so you're wondering whether it was a mouse or a squirrel. Suppose that you hear a noise from the room where a toddler is playing. You stop wondering whether it was a mouse or a squirrel and immediately start wondering whether the little one is right, okay? And then another variant of the case in which you're still wondering whether it was a mouse or a squirrel, you hear a strange noise from the room, but you don't start immediately to wonder whether the toddler is right, okay? You get criticized by someone, okay, out there, and you reply, well, you know, I really care about my plants. I've always wanted to have a nice garden just out of my front door, and that's why I didn't immediately start wondering about whether the little one was right, okay? So you're defending yourself. Now, let's apply the tests that we have here to determine what's going on. Now, in plants 2, it seems that you're motivated by a moral concern for the toddler's well-being. So there's a moral consideration, which I take to be a practical consideration, that speaks in favor of your wondering whether the toddler is right, okay? So you're moved by it. So the first test is passed. Then, of course, in case plants 3, you get criticized for keep wondering about the plants as opposed to start wondering about the kid, okay? And this criticism appears to be fitting, right? Appears to be legitimate. Why? Well, because there's a moral consideration in favor of stop wondering about the plants and start wondering about the toddler's well-being, okay? And so the criticizability test is also passed by the moral consideration. And if we look at the third case, plants 3, clearly you're doing the morally wrong thing, okay? Because you're not caring at all about the toddler, okay? You just keep wondering about your plants. But what you're saying in your reply kind of doesn't make you completely irrational. Why? Well, because you're really responding to prudential reasons. Prudential reasons, most of the cases get outweighed by moral reasons, okay? When we try to decide what we ought to do in general, practically speaking, right? But still, this doesn't mean that the prudential reasons are not reasons for doing a certain thing as opposed to another. Okay? And again, prudential reasons are practical reasons. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, but with some arguments, the first claim is that when we deliberate about what questions to raise, what questions to wonder about, what questions to be puzzled over, practical considerations are considerations that speak in favor of wondering about a certain question as opposed to another. Okay? Why this is interesting? Well, because normally practical considerations are considerations that speak in favor of taking certain actions or taking certain action-involving attitudes such as intentions, right? But interrogative attitudes are different beasts, right? Because they have epistemic satisfaction conditions, right? So what's happening here is that we have an argument for thinking that practical considerations are not just considerations that speak in favor of actions or action-guiding mental states, such as intentions, but they also speak in favor of interrogative attitudes, which are not like intentions. Why are not like intentions? Well, because they have epistemic satisfaction conditions. So that's the first claim that I wanted to make. And the second claim, which I think is a bit more interesting, is that there's a sense in which erotetic deliberation is sensitive to considerations about whether a question is sound or not. And this is where the notion of soundness that we defined earlier plays a role. Okay? So what is soundness, right? So soundness is a property the questions have qua questions. So a question is sound just in case it has a true direct answers. So in the definition of soundness, there's the notion of truth, right? So soundness is essentially a truth-involving notion. And I take truth to be an epistemic value, okay? So that's why considerations about whether a question is sound or not are in this sense, which is, of course, kind of not super strict, but still appeals to this idea of epistemic values as opposed to practical values. This is why soundness considerations are, in some sense, epistemic. Why? Well, because they speak to the fact that a question has a true answer or not, okay? Now, what I want to argue is that there's a sense in which erotetic deliberation is not sensitive to soundness considerations, so to considerations about whether a question is sound or not, but there's another sense in which it is, okay? And I think that this, again, is interesting for the sort of normative profile of erotic deliberation, which makes it different from the most studied cases of deliberation. So take these two cases that you have in page 2, sand and sand 2. So suppose that a friend of yours tells you that there's a true direct answer to the question, how many grains of sand are there on Omaha Beach? So that's the first case. And then there's the second case, which you suppose you're wondering about how many grains of sand there are on Omaha Beach. You hear a strange noise from the room where a toddler is playing, and you don't immediately wonder whether the toddler is right. Okay? You get criticized for this, and you reply, well, the question of the grains of sand has a true answer. So that's why I didn't start wondering about the toddler's well-being right away. Suppose you defend yourself by appealing to soundness considerations. Okay, so in what sense erotic deliberation is not sensitive to soundness considerations? Well, I think that the examples are, in a way, telling. Clearly, from the fact that there's a true answer to a question, this fact alone doesn't motivate us to wonder about that question, okay? Especially if the question is a trivial one. Who cares about the grains of sand on Omaha Beach? Well, if you do care about it, you do have a reason to wonder about it. But it's not the fact that the question has a true answer that motivates you. It's the fact that you care about it. Perhaps you care about all trivial questions, right? Fine. But again, it's the fact that you care about them that motivates you to wonder about them. It's not the fact that the question has a true answer that motivates you to wonder about it. So the motivation test doesn't seem to be passed in this case. And let's just look at the defense test with the case send to. Your defense seems really weird, right? You say, okay, well, you know, this question has a true answer. That's why I kept wondering about it. Again, I would understand. I think that this reply is rationally intelligible to me only if we preface the fact that you do care about the question of the grains of sand. Otherwise, that seems like a bad defense that you're giving, okay? And so, it seems to me that also the defense test isn't passed. And the same holds for the criticism, okay? So, the question of the grains of sand on Omaha Beach as a true direct answer is a sound question. You don't wonder about it. Is that enough for me to criticize you? That seems that it isn't, okay? So, erotetic deliberation is not sensitive to soundness considerations the same way in which it is sensitive to practical considerations, for sure, okay? Why? Well, because the tests are passed in the former case, not passed in the former case, and are passed in the latter, okay? But soundness considerations do play a role in erotetic deliberation in certain special cases, okay? And these are the two cases that you have at the bottom of the page 2 of the handout, okay? So the first case goes like this. Suppose that you care very much about this hydrogen atom here. 10? Okay, cool. Thanks. So you care about this hydrogen atom here, and you wonder about the two questions that you really care about. So the first question is expressed by the sentence, what's its natural isotope? And the second question is expressed by the sentence, what's the position of the electron in this hydrogen atom? Then there's your friend Jane, who's an expert on hydrogen atoms, who tells you, you know, the latter question is pointless because that's indeterminate. And that's one of the phenomena of the quantum indeterminacy phenomena, right? There's no way to determine the position of an electron in an hydrogen atom. We can just give probabilistic expectations, right? So the question doesn't have a true answer, just admits some probabilistic answer to it. It's like 70% of the time the position is such and such, okay? So the question doesn't have a true answer. Doesn't admit a true direct answer, so it's an unsound question. And the second case goes like this. You're talking to your friend Jane, who's an absolute expert about the Beatles. And you tell her that you're curious about why Paul McCartney wrote the song Something in C major. And your friend expert says, that's not a good question, because Paul didn't write the song, George Harrison did. Okay? And I take it that in both cases, it kind of makes sense to change your interrogative attitude, right? So, the first case, you should just stop wondering about the electron's position. Why? Well, because you'll never get a true direct answer to that question. Since you care about the other, just focus on the first question on. And about the Beatles example, kind of makes sense to revise the attitude, the interrogative attitude that you have. You might want to say, okay, sorry, okay, why did George write the song in C major? Or you might want to say, okay, you know, I just care about Paul, so forget about the question. I don't care about it anymore, right? So the soundness considerations play a role in your erotetic deliberation when you already have practical reasons to wonder about questions. Then in some cases, sometimes considerations can be tiebreakers between equally strong practical reasons to wonder about questions. This would be more like the first case. You have equally strong reasons to wonder about the natural isotope of the atom and the position of the electron. Then the Sundance considerations kick in, and you just stop wondering about the former question, right? Second case, the Sundance considerations help you identify really the interrogative attitudes that you really are curious about, for which you really have practical reasons. Okay? And this clearly is something that doesn't happen in the other cases, okay? In the case of belief, the fact that I like cheese very much, that won't determine whether I believe that the moon is made of cheese. And the corresponding claim will be true of practical deliberation. So this makes, again, interrogative attitudes special. And I do have an explanation for why Sundance considerations, which are epistemic, play a role. And my explanation has to do with the fact that these interrogative attitudes have epistemic satisfaction conditions. So the thought is that although the truly normative reasons that speak in favor of wondering about a given question are practical, okay? Then since these interrogative attitudes have epistemic satisfaction conditions, there's something bad about having an attitude that will never be satisfied. So there's something, with an analogy which is a bit crude, but I think it kind of conveys the point. Take a knife, okay? You only have practical reasons to have a knife, right? To use a knife. You have to cut a slice of bread, right? So you don't have to use knives all the time. Just like you don't have to wonder about questions just because they are sound. You need to have practical reasons. But once you need to use the knife, it better be sharp, right? Because the function of the knife is to cut the bread precisely, etc., something that requires sharpness. And the same is true of interrogative attitudes, okay? You need to have practical reasons for them, but once you have those practical reasons, you'd better have interrogative attitudes that can be satisfied, which means they can receive true answers, okay? And that's why these soundness considerations play a role in erotetic deliberation, okay? Which really makes it distinctive with respect to the practical and the doxastic case.